Giant. Once upon a time, a very rich giant lived in a huge mansion surrounded by a big garden. The giant had grown rich because, being a giant, he had wandered all over the world and collected much treasure. But although he was rich, he was very mean. On his travels, he had met many other giants, so one day he thought to himself, "If I go to stay with other giants all over the world, I will save a lot of money." He locked up his own house, closed the gates into his garden, pulled the curtains across his huge windows, and set off. After a year or two, his house became cold and damp. The walls round his garden began to crumble, and the locks fell off the gates. There were many children living nearby who had never dared to go into the giant's garden, but now they did, and the sound of their laughter was heard every day. The garden was filled with fruit trees. The children loved to play among the blossom, and when the fruit appeared, the children climbed the trees and ate the fruit. It didn't matter because the fruit would only have fallen to the ground. But at last the giant came home again. When he saw the children playing in his garden, he flew at them in a rage. Waving his stick, he shouted, "Get out of here! This is a private garden. Be off with you!" The children fled, and the giant was left alone. He repaired the walls and renewed all the locks. Now nobody could get into his garden. But a strange thing happened when spring came along. All over the country, the blossom was blooming on the trees. The flowers were pushing their pretty heads through the soil. The birds were making nests in the trees and under the eaves of the houses. But a little patch of winter stayed over the giant's house. A big black cloud hung over the house. The trees did not blossom, and not one single flower appeared. It was cold, so cold, and the snow stayed on the ground. That silly old giant huddled under the heap of blankets on his bed, getting up only to refill his 6 hot water bottles. Sometimes he looked out of his window at the snow-covered garden and said, "Surely this cold weather can't go on forever." But it did. There was no sign of spring in his garden, although everywhere else the sun was shining and the wind wasn't cold anymore. Then one morning he saw a little robin perched on his window ledge. He had a twig in his beak. A robin making a nest in winter? Surely not, thought the giant. He got out of bed to look through the window, and he got a big surprise. The snow was melting, the trees were blossoming, and he saw that many children had climbed the garden walls and were playing happily. "So that's it," thought the giant. "The spring wouldn't come because I kept the children out." He went down to thank the children, but when they saw the giant, they all ran away from him. Only a tiny boy was left. He was too frightened to run away. His little legs just wouldn't move. The giant went up to him. "It's all right," he said. "I won't hurt you." He picked up the little boy and set him on a branch of a cherry tree. "You can play in my garden any time you like, and so can all your friends. I've learned my lesson." When the other children saw how kindly the giant had treated their friend, they all came back to play. The huge giant tried to dance with them, but he was rather clumsy, and he knocked down part of the garden wall. "I'll knock it all down," he told the children. "I want you to play here." So he knocked down the walls and made sure that any child could get in, big or small. However, the little boy he had put in the cherry tree had disappeared. No one seemed to know where he'd gone. The years went by and the giant grew old. He liked to sit in a large basket chair, watching the children playing and dozing in the sun when it shone. All the children grew to love him. Sometimes, when the giant was asleep, they covered him with blossoms and flowers. And one evening, when the sun had almost gone down, and the giant wakened up from a nap in his basket chair, he saw the little boy he had lost. The little fellow was there again, sitting in the cherry tree, swinging his legs and smiling. The giant rubbed his eyes and looked again. "Am I dreaming?" he said. "Or is it really you?" "Yes, it's me," replied the little boy. "I've come to take you to paradise, if you'll go with me." The giant tottered towards the boy, leaning heavily on his stick, and took his hand. When the children came next day, they saw a mound under the tree, a grassy mound speckled with little flowers. They called it the giant's chair. It reminded them so of the basket chair he used to sit in. The story of the town mouse and the country mouse. Once upon a time, the country mouse invited his cousin the town mouse to stay with him. The country mouse lived all alone under a thick hedge at the corner of a large field. He had a beautiful nest, lined with straw and pieces of sheep's wool, and he lived there in great comfort from one year to the next. When the town mouse arrived on his visit, the country mouse made a great fuss of him. Even before the town mouse had arrived, his cousin had spent long days cleaning out his nest, finding new straw for a fresh lining, and generally making the nest as good as it ever was, and perhaps even better. Then he wandered about collecting grains of wheat and barley and oats, taking load after load to his nest. Then he searched in the orchard and found lots of little apples that had dropped from the trees, but still had lots of juice in them. Finally, he ran across to the farmhouse, and there he found some cheese rinds and half a loaf of bread. But the elegant town mouse was not very impressed by all these good things. He looked down his nose at the food and only nibbled at it. Most of the time he was telling the country mouse about the food he ate when he was in his own home. Finally, as evening came on, and they were sitting together watching the sun go down in a blaze of colours, the town mouse said, "My dear cousin, how can you bear this dull life out here? Nothing much seems to happen here. You should see the town where I live. There's always something going on there. The streets are absolutely full of people night and day, and there are cafes on every corner, so the choice of food is magnificent. I hardly ever have the same meal twice in a row. But here you have to go so far to find food, scrimping and saving as you do, and unless I'm very much mistaken, this meal is no different than all the meals you've had for the past week. Is that not so?" The country mouse said nothing. The town mouse went on, "Now look here, cousin, we don't live forever, do we? So why don't you come away with me and see a bit of life while you can?" After a little more persuasion, the country mouse agreed to go to town for a few days. It was dark when they arrived in the town, but they soon found the right house, and in they scuttled through a hole in the wall. The town mouse led the way into the dining room. The country mouse gazed around in wonder. Never had he seen such a rich room. There were thick carpets on the floor, thick velvet curtains at the window, and warmth, lovely warmth everywhere. In the middle of the room was a huge table, covered with a white cloth, and on it were dishes of every kind of food. Plates of meat and fish, bowls of fruit and nuts, pots of cream and sugar, pieces of bread, and even glasses of wine half filled.
"Come on," cried the Town Mouse. "Let's have a banquet." And on to the table he scrambled, followed by the Country Mouse, who really didn't know what to try first. After a while, the Country Mouse could hardly move. He'd eaten so much. The Town Mouse had been sipping the wine, and he was a bit wobbly on his legs. "Isn't it great here?" he said with a slight hiccup. "I told you, didn't I?" But at that very moment, a door opened, and some people came in the room. The two mice ran off the table as fast as they could, but they were unsteady, and so they fell on the carpet. Then, to their horror, they saw a huge cat. The cat came towards them with a great leap, and the poor Country Mouse could hardly run, he was so full of food. The last he saw of his cousin was as he scrambled up the velvet curtains at the window. The Town Mouse had fortunately found a hole at the bottom of the door. Then the Country Mouse had an even greater shock. The window was open, and a sudden wind blew him off the curtain into the street below. Suddenly, all around him were screeching car tires, horns blaring, feet trying their best to flatten him, people shouting. Oh, it was like the worst nightmare he had ever had in his life. He was lucky enough to get onto a lorry loaded with sacks, and there he stayed until night fell. It took him a long time to get over what had happened to him. He went home, and often, in the calm twilight of the evening, he sat alone thinking of his town cousin and the life he lived there. Going to the town had been a great adventure, but he was glad to be home again, safe in his own warm nest.